This is Meme Analysis, and today we're going to be taking a look at some of the psychology behind spirits and poltergeist phenomena, using Carl Jung's psychology and Aleister Crowley's philosophy of ceremonial magic. So if you're curious as to how these two work together, stick around. So I'm going to be reading from a little collection, Jung on Synchronicity and the Paranormal, and specifically the essay is The Psychological Foundations of Belief in Spirits. So, Jung says, spirits are complexes of the collective unconscious, which appear when the individual loses his adaptation to reality, or which seek to replace the inadequate attitude of a whole people by a new one. They are therefore either pathological fantasies or new but as yet unknown ideas. The psychogenesis of the spirits of the dead seemed to me to be more or less as follows. When a person dies, the feelings and emotions that bound his relatives to him lose their application to reality and sink into the unconscious, where they activate a collective content that has a deleterious effect on consciousness. He also says that I have studied a wide range of spiritualistic literature precisely for these tendencies, and have come to the conclusion that in spiritualism we have a spontaneous attempt of the unconscious to become conscious in a collective form, and ultimately that spirits are exteriorized effects of unconscious complexes. So we get a very clear view that Jung is talking about a kind of operational materialized projection, that it goes beyond the normal type of projection in that it is operating on a mass scale, much in the way that the delusions of a psychotic or the hallucinations of a schizophrenic are purely personal, but often mirroring a collective content. This, on the contrary, is something that a group experiences. And we can see this throughout history, that there are, in fact, mass occult phenomena. Seances are such an example, which Jung talks about a bit more in depth, how he himself was witness to materialized limbs and what they used to refer to as ectoplasm, the kind of material that was left after a seance ghost would appear. And it's interesting, I think, in some ways, and I will get flack for this from the Reichians, but it mirrors some of Reich's ideas about the initial forms that orgone produces, that cosmic superimposition, the effect of pure orgone developing mass. You read about it, I'll have to find the journal, maybe we'll link to it, but they talk about organotic organisms that are kind of like sky jellyfish or sky fishes, and that they are gelatinous and clear, much as ectoplasm is. So I think that that kind of gives us this healthy foundation of libidinal mass becoming spiritual experience. Now I'm going to be reading from Jung's forward to a book on spirits called Spook. This one's really interesting to me because this is his later work. You know, that was a much earlier piece. By now, he's kind of operating on a stranger level. He's aware of synchronicity and aware of a much more meaningful materialization of psychic experience. So, he says, rationalism and superstition are complementary. It is a psychological rule that the brighter the light, the blacker the shadow. In other words, the more rationalistic we are in our conscious minds, the more alive becomes the spectral world of the unconscious. On ghost stories, they are of particular importance in investigating the localization of the unconscious, and the phenomenon of synchronicity, which points to a relativization of space and time, and hence also of matter. Although ghosts exhibit certain universal features, they nevertheless appear in individual forms and under conditions which are infinitely varied and of a special importance for the investigator. So we get a lot of really good material there that in some way ghosts are connected to the relativity of the unconscious. That it is this relative unconscious that allows for internal contents to become external and to really act externally, which is kind of something missing in a lot of the theories on the psyche in general. There's this kind of solipsistic idea, but I think that Jung and Reich are ultimately making a very bold statement, which is that purely internal phenomena can become external and are ultimately real on a mass believable scale. Also that ghosts share a bit of collective nature, that there are some archetypal features, but also that they're deeply informed by the individual. And what he talked about a bit in the previous essay is how, the death of a family member, all of the psychic picture, the psychic likeness of that individual, once that individual is gone, the energy does not simply dissipate. It does not disappear. It is repressed and activates something in the unconscious and is fed into a new form as the spirit. And he talks about the deterioration of the character of the dead. They do lose a bit of the individuality as they become the ghost. We'll look at this more totally in the next reading on poltergeists, where it is essentially lost all personality and is much more bestial and childish, purely playing, not so much a individualized character, not a ghost of somebody so much. So the important thing being that rationality leads to increased ghost phenomena, increased paranormal experiences. You get this idea, and you hear it echoed in fiction a lot, which is odd that you have these romantic writers decrying the death of magic in the wake of industrialization and rationality. I think, on the contrary, we are being given a sandbox with which repressed unconscious contents are going to be having a brilliant time. You can see magic in unfortunate locations, in mass politics. You can see spirits invoked. We are in an aeon of magic where politics are directly utilizing exteriorized unconscious contents to their advantage. They're able to invoke a collective spirit from the people, which you see echoed in fascist literature. And of course, in Marx's famous, there's a specter haunting Europe. Now, one might say, oh, metaphor, but from the Jungian perspective, it's absolutely not. Communism is truly a specter, truly a collective spirit, just as Wotan was for the Nazis. And it's vitally important that we understand the nature of these spirits and how they become materialized. So to finish up Jung's bit, I'm going to be reading from the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, and specifically from the essay on the psychology of the trickster figure, and specifically on poltergeists. Since all mythical figures correspond to inner psychic experiences and originally sprang from them, it is not surprising to find certain phenomena in the field of parapsychology which remind us of the trickster. These are the phenomena connected with poltergeists, and they occur at all times and places in the ambiance of pre-adolescent children. The malicious tricks played by the poltergeist are as well known as the low level of his intelligence and the fatuity of his communications. Ability to change his shape seems also to be one of his characteristics, as there are not a few reports of his appearance in animal form. Since he has on occasion described himself as a soul in hell, the motif of subjective suffering would seem not to be lacking either. His universality is coextensive, so to speak, with that of shamanism, to which, as we know, the whole phenomenology of spiritualism belongs. So, I talked about it a bit before, but the kind of animalistic and childish nature of the poltergeist. But I think we need to go a bit more in depth, and it's unfortunate, but we have to get very morbid and grim, because the truth of poltergeist phenomena tends to be that it involves sexual abuse of a child, and that the poltergeist arises out of that, especially young girls, and especially when they start puberty. There seems to be this kind of repression and exteriorization of the libido as a childish trickster. They've just undergone this kind of horrible but maturing event where their childhood was denied. And so the childhood archetype, the trickster, is exteriorized as poltergeist, as a childish but certainly wicked and angry figure. And you can see this again and again in poltergeist case studies, where there's either childhood abuse or a person's just undergoing puberty when poltergeist phenomena occurs. And let me know in the comments if you've had any anecdotal experiences with this, because I know a lot of my friends have had that as well. So we get a look at how drives and unconscious feelings are repressed and then diverted into spiritualistic phenomena, which goes perfectly with my previous video on Reich, describing the kind of levels of libidinal experience. This is thoroughly in the mystic, where the libido is no longer directly interacting with the senses, but is repressed and reproduced as something bizarre and occult. So, as for the kind of critique from Reichians that I see, where we are vulgarizing Reich by talking about the occult in the context of orgone, I really don't see it that way. The way that I see it is that we are really examining Reich's concept of the mystic as an offshoot of the organotic. I think it must be understood, and I think that the moral application of organotic philosophy is a mistake this early in the game, so to speak. You must have the scientific mind without the morality at first, so that you can establish a general understanding without throwing away really important phenomena. And I think poltergeist phenomena is of that most important value. Seeing how children are affected by their bodies, how they are affected by the horrors of life, and what it does to a young person's drive, where it goes, and what it does. I'm going to finish up this Halloween special with a bit from Aleister Crowley, and I'm going to show kind of how he completely meshes with Jung's view of an unconscious archetype or complex through a environmental stimulus and emotional state is invoked, in Jung's case against the will, but in Crowley's case in accordance with the will. The invocation of the heart girt with a serpent, or the Headless Ritual. Thee I invoke, the Headless One, thee that didst create the earth and the heavens, thee that didst create the night and the day, thee that didst create the darkness and the light. So I'm going to be reading from my copy of the Gersha, which includes Aleister Crowley's essay, The Initiated Interpretation of Ceremonial Magick. In it, he describes, magical phenomena, however, come under a special subclass, since they are willed, and their cause is the series of real phenomena called the operations of ceremonial magic. These consist of sight, the circle, square, triangle, vessels, lamps, robes, implements, etc. Sound, the invocations. Smell, the perfumes. Taste, the sacraments. Touch, as the first. Mind, the combination of all these, and reflection on their significance. These unusual impressions produce unusual brain changes, hence their summary is of unusual kind. Its projection back into the apparently phenomenal world is therefore unusual. Herein, then, consists the reality of the operations and effects of ceremonial magic. And I conceive that the apology is ample, so far as the effect refer only to those phenomena which appear to the magician himself the appearance of the spirit, his conversation, possible shocks from imprudence, and so on, even to ecstasy on the one hand and death or madness on the other. But can any of the effects described in this, our book, Gersha, be obtained, and if so, can you give a rational explanation of the circumstances? Which he goes on to explain that essentially all of the effects that the demons of the Gersha can produce are in fact a kind of subliminal awakening of unconscious knowledge and information from these kind of archetypal complexes that the demons represent and are, in fact. So we kind of get this alternative to Jung's view, where we essentially have the same formula, where a series of environmental states and an emotional state produce an autonomous complex. And this is usually why it's horrifying. Whereas in the case of Crowley and Ceremonial Magick, the magician is intentionally establishing this environment and mental state to get a spiritual experience. They intentionally invoke the unconscious mind and exteriorize it. So, we're given a working formula that's essentially identical with Carl Jung's view of spirits as a unconscious exteriorization. It's just a question of, are the Goethic spirits archetypal? And I think that it's clear that we invoke the archetypal purely in the title, The Lesser Key of Solomon the King. We realize that King Solomon is an archetypal character. He's wise, This is why schizophrenics in the past often had biblical fantasies, biblical ideas, because the Bible holds the great wealth of Western archetypal values. So magic is playing with these values to produce more powerful phenomena. So I hope you've enjoyed our little Halloween special investigating spooky spirits and demonic magic and how these things can actually operate on a real level and what it is that people tend to experience. This theory is very useful for understanding memes. I'll just give the little example. The idea that Jung had that seances are a kind of collective attempt at the unconscious to be made conscious. That is the experience of the meme and the community that produces it. He talks about auto-hypnosis and automatic writing. I think that these are deeply internet states. We can relate to them. That you are hypnotized by the screen and so on. We get into a trance-like state in which we produce memes. There's a great likeness to the seance and to the magical invocation, and there's a lot more to be delved into in this likeness. Hopefully I'll get into it in another video. But for now, I hope you enjoyed what we had to read and say, and please subscribe. And ultimately, remember, memes matter.